I know there are concerns over concessions that are being made to foreign businesses and foreign investors over how legislation here might impact on their bottom line. Can you expand that for us?
In a sense, you could look at the Trans-Pacific Partnership Agreement as a charter of rights for foreign investors. There are certain guarantees that are given to foreign investors about not having restrictions on them vis-a-vis domestic businesses, whether they're goods or service suppliers or simply investors in a business. But there are also certain rules that guarantee to the foreign investors that governments won't regulate in certain ways that damage their profitability or the value of their investment. The special feature of these agreements is that the investors get to enforce the rules themselves, not in our domestic courts, but in offshore private tribunals, where the judges are actually investment lawyers themselves. So one week they might be a judge and the next week they might be acting for a corporation. And there's no particular rules that apply, not like our domestic courts where there are certain rules of due process and where there are rules of precedent, so there's some consistency in the interpretations. These are ad hoc tribunals where it's pretty much a lottery what the outcome will be, and they tend to be very pro-investor.
I know you've been a long-term opponent to free trade. So what's your actual objection to that? What's wrong with it?
Trade is a good thing. Free trade is problematic for several reasons. The first is that it's never actually free trade. And if you look at these negotiations with the US, I mean, it's hardly a level playing field in terms of bargaining. But in addition, the free trade model assumes that the world is a sustainable global economy where what we're seeing internationally is that there are a whole range of features that are going to make that problematic for the next century. If we look at the impacts of climate change, if we look at the food shortages, food scarcity that we've seen, if we look at peak oil and the problems there's going to be with a supply of energy simply to move things around the planet, if we look at the growing inequalities between rich and poor countries and within countries, this model that we've had for the last 30 years, the neoliberal model based largely around a free trade agenda, has really serious problems. If we have a serious financial crisis of the kind that we saw, I think, only the beginnings of a few years ago, all of our countries that are built on credit, and in our case, not credit to government, but actually households and businesses totally dependent on credit, then we're going to be in real turmoil. And one of the areas I do a lot of work on these agreements is the way that the banks and the insurance companies and the whole finance industry has locked governments into that model of the finance sector for time immemorial. And we are going to have huge problems if we try to face how we re-regulate those sectors, how we deal with the dilemma of a financial meltdown, if the finance companies, the banks, the insurers, can threaten to take us to these offshore tribunals. And one of the features of this leaked text we've just seen from the Trans-Pacific Partnership is that the US has succeeded in saying we can't even impose restrictions on currency movements in a balance of payments emergency. That is a very real problem. So you ask, what is the recipe for the future? The recipe for the future is having enough flexibility to deal with the unknowns.
But if we aren't members of the TPP, doesn't that then mean we're outside and that we can't affect anything because we're not inside the organisation? We're left in the position of being the country in the Pacific that isn't part of a Pacific-wide trade organisation.
If New Zealand doesn't join the Trans-Pacific Partnership Agreement, I suspect that will be because there isn't a Trans-Pacific Partnership Agreement, that the negotiations have failed. And one of the reasons why quite a number of the parties to the negotiations are wondering, in fact, whether it's worth it, is that there is already a significant web of free trade agreements amongst the existing parties. And there is not an awful lot of economic gain to be made from removing the remaining barriers, except for those countries that don't have a free trade agreement with the US, which is Vietnam and Malaysia and Brunei and New Zealand. But what we also know is that the areas that New Zealand wants to open up in the US are enormously politically sensitive, and especially going into an election in the US, US decisions are made according to their domestic politics. New Zealand, on the other hand, has a number of free trade agreements, including with China, and there is some nervousness, actually, that the Trans-Pacific Partnership Agreement may disrupt some of those other relationships. If you listen to a lot of the rhetoric in the US, it sees the Trans-Pacific Partnership as the counterpoint to China's influence in Asia especially. And in the APEC meeting last year in Honolulu, they were describing a two-pronged approach for what they called America's Pacific Century. Some others called it the Obama Doctrine, which was a remilitarization by the US in the region and the Trans-Pacific Partnership as the economic limb of the US entry point. Australia and New Zealand depend on China. Alienating China is not going to be good for us.
Now we'll take a brief break there and then we'll come back and chat some more. Before the break we were talking about the problems that you see with the TPP, but surely there must be some pluses in it.
Of course, we don't know the details of what's in the Trans-Pacific Partnership, so being able to do a full cost-benefit analysis is extremely difficult. All we have to work on at present is leaks of a number of chapters, in particular those that deal with medicines and information technology, and the clear assessment there is that the only winner out of those rules would be the US. In the investment sector, it's interesting that the Australians have said no, in particular to the right of investors to sue, based largely on advice from their Productivity Commission, that those kinds of rules have no clear economic gains and carry significant fiscal and policy risks. If we had more of the texts released, we would be in a position to conduct cost-benefit analyses. Well, the official line is that you can't negotiate trade-offs in public because affected sectors will put pressure on that make it difficult for negotiators to do their job. My personal view is that, as we've seen in the last week, their fear is that if the details are out in the public domain, it will generate a debate and it will mean that people say this deal isn't in our interests. It's been very interesting to see the way that this particular agreement has become super secretive. Pressure about that kind of secrecy at the World Trade Organization has seen the release of most of the negotiating documents, and they might say that's one of the reasons why the Doha round has in fact not concluded, but if that's the case, then maybe the Doha round wasn't the best thing since sliced bread. In some other recent negotiations, there was a very important one called ACTA, the Anti-Counterfeiting Trade Agreement, where successive leaks led to those documents being officially released by the same parties to this negotiation. So we're actually seeing them retreat into a much more secret zone. Even the so-called stakeholder participation at the various rounds of negotiations has become more and more insular. And so it's designed in a way to deter people even from bothering to go.
Tim Grosser insists that he's not negotiating away our sovereignty.
The Minister always tells us that we can trust him. But there's been a bit of a mixed message from him in this last discussion. On the one hand, he said he won't negotiate away New Zealand's right to make legitimate public policy decisions. The question is, what is legitimate and who is going to get to determine that? And that will actually be the disputes tribunals if these decisions get challenged. But he's also very explicit that these agreements do involve giving up sovereignty. He just thinks that that trade-off of some sovereignty for some projected economic gains, which we actually don't know currently what they might be, is worth it.
You've been a tireless campaigner against the TPP, and I've spoken to you many times over the past months and probably years about the subject, but is it worth the fight?
Those of us who lived through the 1980s and the kinds of decision-making that locked New Zealand into a new model where people didn't really understand the implications is in a sense being repeated with these negotiations and these kinds of agreements. And the Trans-Pacific Partnership goes much further than anyone has before. So if we're looking now at the question of whether that model is good for future generations, there's an obligation on those of us who understand the minutiae of these highly technical agreements to ring the alarm bells and to try to slow down the process and create enough space and enough understanding for New Zealanders to be able to engage in a proper debate about our future and not have that discussion foreclosed by a deal done behind closed doors that carry a price that may be too high for us to pay in trying to choose a different way forward.
Well, Professor Jane Kelsey, thank you very much indeed for your time.
It's a pleasure.